From a young age, we are taught the story of the Pilgrims, about how a group of people sailed across the sea in the Mayflower to escape religious persecution from the monarchs of England in the hopes of building a better life, in the process laying the foundations for America. This story is largely accurate, though dramatically oversimplified. However, it ignores several key details and motives relating to the establishment of Plymouth. Oftentimes, tellings more closely resemble folklore than actual history. The Pilgrims' real reasons for coming to America were far more complex than is led on by this simple tale. You likely know that the Pilgrims were part of a religious group called the Puritans, but what exactly is a Puritan? To keep things brief, the Puritan movement began in England after King Henry VIII separated the nation from the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, which placed him, the King of England, as the head of all religious matters in the nation, similar to the Pope. Anglicanism, at least at the time, was far closer to Catholicism than most other Protestant denominations, continuing many of Rome's traditions and structures. Opinions varied on how this young church ought to be run. Many factions arose demanding changes to be made. Among these were the Puritans, who believed the church should be reformed even further, purified if you will. However, these Puritans were not the Pilgrims. There were several key differences between the two. Puritans did not object to the doctrines of the national church, and proposed no revolution against it. They only desired and strove for reformation within the church. The Pilgrims we are familiar with are an offshoot of a different group, the Separatists. Within the Anglican Church, there was a growing divide. The Church of England had very loose restrictions on who could be a part of it. This resulted in everyone, from radical Puritans to those who wanted Anglicanism to more resemble Catholicism, to be in the same church. This led to a struggle for control over the direction of the English Church. On one side, there were the Puritans, also known as nonconformists, who wanted to purify the church of all remnants of Catholicism, such as traditions like Christmas. On the other, there were those who conformed to the current system and wanted the church to remain as it was and carry on many of the old traditions and customs from Catholicism. The Separatists were those who'd given up on the church altogether, instead opting to form their own separate congregations. For this, they were denounced both by conforming Anglicans and Puritans alike. At this time, deviation from the Church of England was unacceptable because church and state were inseparably mixed, and to challenge the authority of the Church of England was also to challenge the authority of the king. Separatists were ruthlessly persecuted by English authorities. Their plight is recounted by William Bradford, the future governor and historian of Plymouth Colony. Some were taken and clapped up in prison. Others had their houses beset and watched night and day, and hardly escaped their hands, and the most were fain to flee and leave their houses and habitation, and the means of their livelihood. To avoid torment from both the government and their fellow citizens, Separatists began to meet in secret and form congregations together. The group of Separatists that we are concerned with are the congregation from the small town of Scrooby, Nottinghamshire. The congregation elected its leaders, a custom that they would bring with them to the New World. Their preacher was a man named Richard Clifton. His assistant and successor was John Robinson, who would preside over the congregation by the time they relocated to Plymouth. Also among them was their future ruling elder, William Brewster, who would become an instrumental figure as he led the colony's church proceedings for some time. Finally, there was William Bradford, an energetic and capable young man now remembered for his over 30 years served as governor of Plymouth, along with his aforementioned role as the colony's chief historian. We have Bradford to thank for a large portion of this information. Fed up with the persecution and hiding, the congregation made the decision to flee England. The decision was a tough one, and many were reluctant to leave behind their lives and journey to an unfamiliar land, learn a new language, and find new jobs. Also in their way was the law, which did not allow them to leave England without permission from the government, which they would never receive. In order to get out of England, they turned to smugglers and bribing sailors at a steep cost. In some cases, they were betrayed by their transporters and turned into the authorities. However, through their persistence, they were able to escape England. It may seem that I've contradicted myself, as the Separatists were clearly being oppressed, and in fleeing England could not be considered anything but religious refugees. This would be correct if it were not for one thing. In 1607, the congregation relocated, not to America, but to Amsterdam, 13 years before the trip to America. They chose this destination because the Dutch had been one of the first countries in Europe to allow freedom of religion within its borders. The Scrooby Congregation were neither the first nor the last Separatists to make this journey, and they had finally escaped the persecution and torment that they had been subjected to for years. They had found asylum. Soon after, they left Amsterdam in favor of the small city of Leiden. Yet despite their newfound freedom, they still went on to take their pilgrimage across the Atlantic a little over a decade later, a dangerous move that left a large number of them dead. What caused this now free congregation to take such a drastic measure with so little a guarantee of success? It cannot have been the pursuit of religious freedom, since they already had that in Holland. What really drove the Pilgrims to risk life and limb to settle in America? In truth, there were three main reasons for their journey. The first was economic. Most of the English were not citizens of Leiden and did not enjoy the privileges of citizenship. Their employment possibilities were limited, and they had to work hard just to keep up a low standard of living. The second reason was cultural. Though they had horrendous experiences back in their home country and did not conform to the Anglican Church, the Pilgrims were still Englishmen. Yet to their dismay, the environment began affecting the congregation's children, who as time went on became more and more Dutch culturally. Also worth remembering is that this group was extreme, even for the Puritans, and now they were residing in the Netherlands, one of the most secular and least Christian nations in Europe at the time. Their children, who had spent much of their lives in poverty, were, to quote William Bradford, drawn away by evil examples into extravagant and dangerous courses. They were certain that if they stayed in Leiden, the congregation would soon assimilate to Dutch culture, an idea completely unthinkable to these zealous Englishmen. Another reason was minor in comparison to the others, but still worth mentioning. There were fears that conflict would reignite between the Netherlands and Spain, which was not an uncommon occurrence for the time period. Leiden was near the border, and should a war break out, the town could have ended up in the crossfire, a very real fear for the congregation. Lastly, they wished to have their own homeland instead of taking refuge in another. They desired to build an ideal society, pure of any sinister forces that could lead them or their children astray. That would be impossible in Leiden, or anywhere else on the continent for that matter. Yet in the New World, there was boundless opportunity. Nowhere else would they be able to establish their utopia, and so the choice was easy. They chose to cross the Atlantic and found Plymouth. The Pilgrims were not religious refugees in any sense of the word. They themselves did not even believe in freedom of religion, relentlessly persecuting Quakers in much the same manner as had been inflicted upon them. Instead, they were settlers, intent on establishing their perfect Puritan utopia far away from the perceived immorality of Europe. Even beyond the sentiment of the Pilgrims themselves, the official purpose of their colony, at least initially, was to make money above all else. If you are interested in learning more about the economic side of Plymouth, then watch my previous video on the company. Ultimately, the Pilgrims had an array of reasons for settling in America, but the pursuit of religious freedom was not among them.